The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 1, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 3, Side 2. Soon these highways would far surpass in durability and extent the Persian and Carthaginian roads that had served them as models. The oldest of them was the Via Latina, which about 370 B.C. brought Romans out to the Alban Hills. In 312, Appius Claudius the Blind, with the labor of thousands of criminals, started the Via Appia, or Appian Way, between Rome and Capua. Later it reached out to Beneventum, Venusia, Brindisium, and Tarentum. Its 333 English miles bound the two coasts, eased trade with Greece and the East, and collaborated with the other roads to make Italy one nation. In 241, the censor Aurelius Cotta began the Aurelian Way from Rome through Pisa and Genoa to Antibes. Caius Flaminius in 220 opened the Flaminian Way to Ariminum, and about the same time the Valerian Way connected Tibur with Corfinium. Slowly the majestic network grew. The Aemilian Way climbed north from Ariminum through Bononia and Mutina to Placentia in 187. The Postumian Way linked Genoa with Verona in 148, and the Via Popilia led from Ariminum through Ravenna to Padua in 132. In the following century, roads would dart out from Italy to York, Vienna, Thessalonica, and Damascus, and would line the North African coast. They defended, unified, and vitalized the empire by quickening the movement of troops, intelligence, customs, and ideas. They became great channels of commerce and played no minor role in the peopling and enrichment of Italy and Europe. Despite these highways, trade never flourished in Italy as in the eastern Mediterranean. The upper classes looked with contempt upon buying cheap and selling dear, and left trade to Greek and Oriental freedmen, while the countryside contented itself with occasional fairs and ninth-day markets in the towns. Foreign commerce was similarly moderate. Sea transport was risky, ships were small, made only 6 miles an hour sailing or rowing, hugged the coast, and for the most part kept timidly in port from November to March. Carthage controlled the western Mediterranean, the Hellenistic monarchies controlled the east. The pirates periodically swept out of their lairs upon merchants relatively more honest than themselves. The Tiber was perpetually silting its mouth and blocking Rome's port at Ostia. 200 vessels foundered there in one gale. Besides, the current was so strong that the voyage upstream to Rome hardly repaid the labor and the cost. About 200 B.C., vessels began to put in at Puteoli, 150 miles south of Rome, and ship their goods overland to the capital. To facilitate this external and internal trade, it became necessary to establish a state-guaranteed system of coinage, measures, and weights. Till the 4th century B.C., cattle were still accepted as a medium of exchange, since they were universally valuable and easily moved. As trade grew, rude chunks of copper, or S, were used as money, circa 330 B.C. Estimate was originally estumare, to value copper. The unit of value was the as, A.S., 1, that is, 1 pound of copper by weight. Expend meant weighed out. When about 338 B.C. a copper coinage was issued by the state, it often bore the image of an ox, a sheep, or a hog, and was accordingly called pecunia, from pecus, cattle. In the First Punic War, says Pliny, the Republic, not having means to meet its needs, reduced the ass to 2 ounces of copper. By this contrivance, a saving of 5/6 was effected, and the public debt was liquidated. By 202, the ass had fallen to 1 ounce, and in 87 B.C. it was reduced to half an ounce to help finance the social war. In 269, 2 silver coins were minted, the denarius, equal to 10 asses, and corresponding to the Athenian drachma in the latter's depreciated Hellenistic form, and the sestertius, representing 2.5 asses, or 1/4 of a denarius. In 217 appeared the first Roman gold coins, the aurei, with values of 20, 40, and 60 sesterces. In metallic equivalents, the ass would equal 2, the sesterce 5, the denarius 20 cents in the currency of the United States. But as precious metals were much less plentiful than now, and therefore had a purchasing power several times greater than today, we shall, ignoring price fluctuations before Nero, roughly equate the ass, sesterce, denarius, and talent, or 6,000 denarii, of the Roman Republic with 6, 15, and 60 cents, and $3,600, respectively, in terms of United States currency in 1942. The issuance of this guaranteed currency promoted the profession and operations of finance. The older Romans used temples as their banks, as we use banks as our temples. And the state continued to the end to use its strongly built shrines as repositories for public funds, perhaps on the theory that religious scruples would help discourage robbery. Money lending was an old business, for the 12 tables had forbidden interest above 8 1/3% per annum. The legal rate was lowered to 5% in 347 and to 0 in 342, but this Aristotelian prohibition was so easily evaded that the actual minimum rate averaged 12%. Usury above 12% was widespread, and debtors had periodically to be rescued from their accumulating obligations by bankruptcy or legislation. In 352 BC, the government used a very modern method of relief. It took over such mortgages as offered a fair chance of repayment and persuaded mortgagees to accept a lower interest rate on the others. One of the streets adjoining the Forum became a banker's row, crowded with the shops of the money lenders, or argentarii, and money changers, or trapezatai. Money could be borrowed on land, crops, securities, or government contracts, and for financing commercial enterprises or voyages. Cooperative lending took the place of industrial insurance. Instead of one banker completely underwriting a venture, several joined in providing the funds. Joint stock companies existed chiefly for the performance of government contracts let out on bids by the censor. They raised their capital by selling their stocks or bonds to the public in the form of partes, or particuli, little parts, shares. These companies of publicans, that is, men engaged on public or state undertakings, played an active role in supplying and transporting materials for the army and navy in the Second Punic War, not without the usual attempts to cheat the government. Businessmen, or equites, directed the larger share of these enterprises, freedmen the smaller. Non-governmental business was carried on by negotiatores, who usually provided their own funds. Industry was in the hands of independent craftsmen, working in their separate shops. Most such men were freemen, but an increasing proportion were freedmen or slaves. Labor was highly differentiated and produced for the market rather than for the individual customer. Competition by slaves depressed the wages of free workers and reduced the proletariat to a bitter life in slums. Strikes among these men were impracticable and rare, but slave uprisings were frequent. The First Servile War, 139 BC, was not the first. When public discontent became acute, some cause could be found for a war that would provide universal employment, spread depreciated money, and turn the wrath of the people against a foreign foe whose lands would feed the Roman people victorious or receive them defeated and dead. The free workers had unions or guilds, collegia, but these seldom concerned themselves with wages, hours, or conditions of labor. Tradition credited Numa with having established or legalized them. In any case, the 7th century BC had organizations of flute players, goldsmiths, coppersmiths, fullers, shoemakers, potters, dyers, and carpenters. The Dionysian artists, actors, and musicians were among the most widespread associations in the ancient world. By the 2nd century BC, we find guilds of cooks, tanners, builders, bronze workers, iron workers, rope makers, weavers. But these were probably as old as the others. The chief aim of such unions was the simple pleasure of social intercourse. Many of them were also mutual benefit societies to defray the cost of funerals. The state regulated not only the guilds, but many aspects of Rome's economic life. It supervised the operation of mines and other governmental concessions or contracts. It quieted agitation among the plebs by importing food and distributing it at nominal prices to the poor or to all applicants. It levied fines upon monopolists, and it nationalized the salt industry to end a monopoly that had raised the price of salt beyond the reach of the working class. Its commercial policy was liberal. After overcoming Carthage, it opened the western Mediterranean to all trade, and it protected Utica and later Delos on condition that they remain free ports, permitting the entry and exit of goods without fee. At various times, however, it forbade the export of arms, iron, wine, oil, or cereals. It laid a customs duty, usually of 2.5%, upon the entry of most products into Rome, and afterward extended this modest tariff to other cities. Until 147 BC, it required a tributum, or property tax, throughout Italy. All in all, its revenues were modest, and like other civilized states, it used them chiefly for war. 7. The city. Through taxes, spoils, indemnities, and inflowing population, Rome was now, by 202 BC, one of the major cities of the Mediterranean ensemble. The census of 234 listed 270,713 citizens, that is, free adult males. The figure fell sharply during the Great War, but rose to 258,318 in 189 and 322,000 in 147. We may calculate a population of approximately 1,100,000 souls in the city-state in 189 BC, of whom perhaps 275,000 lived within the walls of Rome. Italy south of the Rubicon had some 5 million inhabitants. Immigration, the absorption of conquered peoples, the influx, emancipation, and enfranchisement of slaves were already beginning the ethnic changes that by Nero's time would make Rome the New York of antiquity, half native and half everything. Two main cross streets divided the city into quarters, each with its administrative officials and tutelary deities. Chapels were raised at important intersections, and statues at lesser ones, to the Lares Capitales, or gods of the crossings, a pretty custom still found in Italy. Most streets were plain earth, some were paved with small, smooth stones from riverbeds, as in many Mediterranean cities today. About 174, the censor began to surface the major thoroughfares with lava blocks. In 312, Appius Claudius the Blind built the first aqueduct, bringing fresh water to a city that had till then depended upon springs and wells and the muddy Tiber. Piping water from aqueduct-fed reservoirs, the aristocracy began to bathe more than once a week, and soon after Hannibal's defeat, Rome opened its first municipal baths. At an unknown date, Roman or Etruscan engineers built the Cloaca Maxima, whose massive stone arches were so wide that a wagon loaded with hay could pass under them. Smaller sewers were added to drain the marshes that surrounded and invaded Rome. The city's refuse and rainwater passed through openings in the streets into these drains and thence into the Tiber, whose pollution was a lasting problem of Roman life. The embellishment of the city was almost confined to its temples. Houses adhered to the plain Etruscan style already described, except that the interior was more often of brick or stucco, and, as a sign of growing literacy, was often defaced with graffiti, scratchings of strictly fugitive verse or prose. Temples were mostly of wood, with terracotta revetments and decorations, and followed Etruscan plans. A temple to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva stood on the Capitoline Hill, another to Diana on the Aventine, and others rose, before 201 BC, to Juno, Mars, Janus, Venus, Victory, Fortune, Hope, etc. In 303, Caius Fabius added to his leguminous clan name the cognomen of Pictor, painter, by executing frescoes in the Temple of Health on the Capitoline. Greek sculptors in Rome made statues of Roman gods and heroes in terracotta, marble, or bronze. In 293 they erected on the Capitol a bronze Jupiter of such Olympian proportions that it could be seen from the Alban Hills 20 miles away. About 296 the Aediles set up a bronze she-wolf, to which later artists added the figures of Romulus and Remus. We do not know if this is the group described by Cicero, or if either of these is identical with the existing wolf of the Capitol. In any case, we have in this a masterpiece of the highest order, dead metal, alive in every muscle and nerve. While through painting and statuary the aristocracy commemorated its victories and recommended its lineage, the people consoled themselves with music and dance, comedies and games. The roads and homes of Italy resounded with individual or choral song. Men sang at banquets, boys and girls chorused hymns in religious processions, bride and groom were escorted with hymeneal chants, and every corpse was buried with song. The flute was the most popular instrument, but the lyre too had its devotees, and became the favorite accompaniment of lyric verse. When great holidays came, the Romans crowded to amphitheater or stadium, and pullulated under the sun while hirelings, captives, criminals, or slaves ran and jumped, or, better, fought and died. Two great amphitheaters, the Circus Maximus, attributed to the first Tarquin, and the Circus Flaminius, in 221 BC, admitted without charge all free men and women who came in time to find seats. The expense was met at first by the state, then by the aediles out of their own purse, often, in the later republic, by candidates for the consulate. The cost increased generation by generation until in effect it barred the poor from seeking office. Perhaps we should class with these spectacles the official triumph of a returning general. Only those were eligible for it who had won a campaign in which 5,000 of the enemy had been slain. The unfortunate commander who had won with less slaughter received merely an ovation. For him no ox was sacrificed, but only a sheep, or ovis. The procession formed outside the city, at whose borders the general and his troops were required to lay down their arms. Thence it entered through a triumphal arch that set a fashion for 1,000 monuments. Trumpeters led the march. After them came towers or floats representing the captured cities, and pictures showing the exploits of the victors. Then wagons rumbled by, heavy with gold, silver, works of art, and other spoils. Marcellus's triumph was memorable for the stolen statuary of Syracuse in 212. Scipio Africanus in 207 displayed 14,000, and in 202 123,000 pounds of silver taken from Spain and Carthage. 70 white oxen followed, walking philosophically to their death, then the captured chiefs of the enemy, then lictors, harpers, pipers, and incense-bearers, then, in a flamboyant chariot, the general himself, wearing a purple toga and a crown of gold, bearing an ivory scepter and a laurel branch as emblems of victory and the insignia of Jove. In the chariot with him might be his children. Beside it rode his relatives, behind them his secretaries and aides. Last came the soldiers, some carrying the prizes awarded them, everyone wearing a crown. Some praising their leaders, others deriding them, for it was an inviolable tradition that on these brief occasions the speech of the army should be free and unpunished, to remind the proud victors of their fallible mortality. The general mounted the Capitol to the temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, laid his lute at the feet of the gods, presented an animal in sacrifice, and usually ordered the captive chieftains to be slain as an additional thank-offering. It was a ceremony well designed to stir military ambition and reward military effort, for man's vanity yields only to hunger and love. 8. Post-mortem. War was the most dramatic feature of a Roman's life, but it did not play so absorbing a role as in the pages of Rome's historians. Perhaps even more than with us, his existence centered about his family and his home. News reached him when it was old, so that his passions could not be stirred every day by the gathered turmoil of the world. The great events of his career were not politics and war, but anxious births, festal marriages, and somber deaths. Old age was not then the abandoned desolation that so often darkens it in an individualistic age. The young never questioned their duty to care for the old. The old remained to the end the first consideration and the last authority, and after their death their graves were honored as long as a male descendant survived. Funerals were as elaborate as weddings. The procession was led by a hired band of wailing women, whose organized hysteria was cramped by a law of the 12 tables forbidding them to tear out their hair. Then came the flute players, limited by a like Solonic law to 10, then some dancers, one of whom impersonated the dead. Then followed in strange parade actors wearing the death masks or waxen images of those ancestors of the corpse who had held some magistracy. The deceased came next, in splendor rivaling a triumph, clothed in the full regalia of the highest office he had held, comfortable in a bier overspread with purple and gold-embroidered coverlets, and surrounded by the weapons and armor of the enemies he had slain. Behind him came the dead man's sons, dressed and veiled in black, his daughters unveiled, his relatives, clansmen, friends, clients, and freedmen. In the forum the procession stopped, and a son or kinsman pronounced a eulogy. Life was worth living, if only for such a funeral. In the early centuries Rome's dead had been cremated. Now, usually, they were buried, though some obstinate conservatives preferred combustion. In either case, the remains were placed in a tomb that became an altar of worship upon which pious descendants periodically placed some flowers and a little food. Here, as in Greece and the Far East, the stability of morals and society was secured by the worship of ancestors and by the belief that somewhere their spirits survived and watched. If they were very great and good, the dead, in Hellenized Roman mythology, passed to the Elysian fields or the islands of the blessed. Nearly all, however, descended into the earth, to the shadowy realm of Orcus and Pluto. Pluto, the Roman form of the Greek god Hades, was armed with a mallet to stun the dead. Orcus, our ogre, was the monster who then devoured the corpse. Because Pluto was the most exalted of the underground deities, and because the earth was the ultimate source of wealth and often the repository of accumulated food and goods, he was worshipped also as the god of riches and plutocrats. And his wife, Proserpina, the strayed daughter of Ceres, became the goddess of the germinating corn. Sometimes the Roman hell was conceived as a place of punishment. In most cases it was pictured as the abode of half-formless shades that had been men, not distinguished from one another by reward or punishment, but all equally suffering eternal darkness and final anonymity. There at last, said Lucian, one would find democracy. Chapter 5. The Greek Conquest, 201 to 146 BC. 1. The Conquest of Greece. When Philip V of Macedon made an alliance with Hannibal against Rome in 214, he hoped that all Greece would unite behind him to slay the growing young giant of the West. But rumors were about that he was planning, if Carthage won, to conquer all Greece with Carthage's aid. As a result, the Aetolian League signed a pact to help Rome against Philip, and the clever Senate, before dispatching Scipio to Africa, used Philip's discouragement by persuading him to a separate peace, this in 205. The victory of Zama had hardly been won when the Senate, which never forgave an injury, began to plot revenge upon Macedon. Rome, the Senate felt, could never be secure with so strong a power at her back across a narrow sea. When the Senate moved for war, the assembly demurred, and a tribune accused the patricians of seeking to divert attention from domestic ills. The opponents of war were easily silenced by charges of cowardice and lack of patriotism, and in 202 BC, T. Quinctius Flamininus sailed against Macedon. He was a youth of 30, one of that liberal Hellenizing circle which was gathering about the Scipios in Rome. After some careful maneuvering, he met Philip at Cynocephali and overwhelmed him, this in 197. Then he surprised all the Mediterranean nations, and perhaps Rome, by restoring the chastened Philip to a bankrupt and weakened throne, and offering freedom to all Greece. The imperialists in the Senate protested, but for a moment the liberals predominated, and in 196 the herald of Flamininus announced to a vast assemblage at the Isthmian Games that Greece was to be free from Rome, from Macedon, from tribute, even from garrisons. So great a cheer rose from the multitude, says Plutarch, that crows flying over the stadium fell dead. When a cynical world questioned the sincerity of the Roman general, he answered by withdrawing his army to Italy. It was a bright page in the history of war. But one war always invites another. The Aetolian League resented Rome's emancipation of Greek cities formerly subject to the League, and appealed to Antiochus III, the Seleucid king, to reliberate liberated Greece. Inflated with some easy victories in the east, Antiochus thought of extending his power over all Western Asia. Pergamum, fearing him, called to Rome for help. The Senate sent Scipio Africanus and his brother Lucius with the first Roman army to touch Asiatic soil. The hostile forces met at Magnesia in 189, and Rome's victory inaugurated her conquest of the Hellenistic East. The Romans marched north, drove back into Galatia, or Anatolia, the Gauls who had threatened Pergamum, and earned the gratitude of all Ionian Greeks. The Greeks of Europe were not so pleased. Roman armies had spared Greek soil, but they now encompassed Greece on east and west. Rome had freed the Greeks, but on condition that both war and class war should end. Freedom without war was a novel and irksome life for the city-states that made up Hellas. The upper classes yearned to play power politics against neighboring cities, and the poor complained that Rome everywhere buttressed the rich against the poor. In 171, Perseus, son and successor of Philip V as king of Macedon, having arranged an alliance with Seleucus IV and Rhodes, called upon Greece to rise with him against Rome. 3 years later, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, son of the consul who had fallen at Cannae, defeated Perseus at Pydna, razed 70 Macedonian towns, and led Perseus captive to grace a magnificent triumph at Rome. Rhodes was punished by the emancipation of her tributary cities in Asia and by the establishment of a competitive port at Delos. 1,000 Greek leaders, including the historian Polybius, were taken as hostages to Italy, where in 16 years of exile 700 of them died. During the next decade, the relations between Greece and Rome moved even nearer to open enmity. The rival cities, factions, and classes of Hellas appealed to the Senate for support, and gave cause for interferences that made Greece actually subject, though nominally free. The partisans of the Scipios in the Senate were overruled by realists who felt that there would be no lasting peace or order in Greece until it was completely under Roman rule. In 146, the cities of the Achaean League, while Rome was in conflict with Carthage and Spain, announced a war of liberation. Leaders of the poor seized control of the movement, freed and armed the slaves, declared a moratorium on debts, promised a redistribution of land, and added revolution to war. When the Romans under Mummius entered Greece, they found a divided people and easily overcame the undisciplined Greek troops. Mummius burned Corinth, slew its males, sold its women and children into bondage, and carried nearly all its movable wealth and art to Rome. Greece and Macedon were made into a Roman province under a Roman governor. Only Athens and Sparta were allowed to remain under their own laws. Greece disappeared from political history for 2,000 years. 2. The transformation of Rome. Step by step the Roman Empire grew. not so much through conscious design as through the compulsions of circumstance and the ever-receding frontiers of security. In bloody battles at Cremona in 200 and Mutina in 193, the legions again subdued Cisalpine Gaul and pushed the boundaries of Italy to the Alps. Spain, re-won from Carthage, had to be kept under control lest Carthage should win it again. Besides, it was rich in iron, silver, and gold. The Senate exacted from it a heavy annual tribute in the form of bullion and coin, and the Roman governors reimbursed themselves liberally for spending a year away from home. So Quintus Minucius, after a brief proconsulate in Spain, brought to Rome 34,800 pounds of silver and 35,000 silver denarii. Spaniards were conscripted into the Roman army. Scipio Aemilianus had 40,000 of them in the force with which he took Spanish Numantia. In 195 B.C., the tribes broke out in wild revolt, which Marcus Cato put down with a hard integrity that recalled the proud virtues of a vanishing Roman breed. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, in 179, adjusted his rule sympathetically to the character and civilization of the native population, made friends of the tribal chieftains, and distributed land among the poor. But one of his successors, Lucius Lucullus, in 151, violated the treaties made by Gracchus, attacked without cause any tribe that could yield plunder, and slaughtered or enslaved thousands of Spaniards without bothering to invent a pretext. Sulpicius Galba, in 150, lured 7,000 natives to his camp by a treaty promising them land. When they arrived, he had them surrounded and enslaved or massacred. In 154, the tribes of Lusitania, or Portugal, began a 6-year war against Rome. An able leader, Viriathus, appeared among them, heroic in stature, endurance, courage, and nobility. For 8 years he defeated every army sent against him, until at last the Romans purchased his assassination. The rebellious Celtiberians of central Spain bore a siege of 15 months in Numantia, living on their dead. At last, in 133, Scipio Aemilianus starved them into surrender. In general, the policy of the Roman Republic in Spain was so brutal and dishonest that it cost more than it paid. Never, said Mommsen, had war been waged with so much perfidy, cruelty, and avarice. The plunder from the provinces provided the funds for that orgy of corrupt and selfish wealth which was to consume the Republic in revolution. The indemnities paid by Carthage, Macedon, and Syria, the slaves that poured into Rome from every field of glory, the precious metals captured in the conquest of Cisalpine Gaul and Spain, the 400 million sesterces, or $60 million, taken from Antiochus and Perseus, the 4,503 pounds of gold and 220,000 pounds of silver seized by Manlius Vulso in his Asiatic campaigns. These and other windfalls turned the propertied classes in Rome in half a century, from 202 to 146 B.C., from men of means into persons of such opulence as hitherto only monarchs had known. Soldiers returned from these gigantic raids with their pouches full of coins and spoils. As currency multiplied in Italy faster than building, the owners of realty in the capital tripled their fortunes without stirring a muscle or a nerve. Industry lagged while commerce flourished. Rome did not have to produce goods. It took the world's money and paid with that for the world's goods. Public works were expanded beyond precedent and enriched the publicans who lived on state contracts. Any Roman who had a little money bought shares in their corporations. Banks proliferated and prospered. They paid interest on deposits, cashed checks, or prescriptiones, met bills for their clients, lent and borrowed money, made or managed investments, and fattened on such relentless usury that cutthroat, or sector, and moneylender became one word. Rome was becoming not the industrial or commercial, but the financial and political center of the white man's world. Equipped with such means, the Roman patriciate and upper middle class passed with impressive speed from stoic simplicity to reckless luxury. The lifetime of Cato, from 234 to 149, saw the transformation almost completed. Houses became larger as families became smaller. Furniture grew lavish in a race for conspicuous expense. Great sums were paid for Babylonian rugs, for couches inlaid with ivory, silver, or gold. Precious stones and metals shone on tables and chairs, on the bodies of women, on the harness of horses. As physical exertion diminished and wealth expanded, the old simple diet gave way to long and heavy meals of meat, game, delicacies, and condiments. Exotic foods were indispensable to social position or pretense. One magnate paid 1,000 sesterces for the oysters served at a meal. Another imported anchovies at 1,600 sesterces a cask. Another paid 1,200 for a jar of caviar. Good chefs fetched enormous prices on the slave auction block. Drinking increased. Goblets had to be large and preferably of gold. Wine was less diluted, sometimes not at all. Sumptuary laws were passed by the Senate limiting expenditure on banquets and clothing, but as the senators ignored these regulations, no one bothered to observe them. The citizens, Cato mourned, no longer listened to good advice, for the belly has no ears. The individual became rebelliously conscious of himself as against the state, the son as against the father, the woman as against the man. Usually the power of woman rises with the wealth of a society, for when the stomach is satisfied, hunger leaves the field to love. Prostitution flourished. Homosexualism was stimulated by contact with Greece and Asia. Many rich men paid a talent, or $3,600 for a male favorite. Cato complained that a pretty boy cost more than a farm. But women did not yield the field to these Greek and Syrian invaders. They took eagerly to all those supports of beauty that wealth now put within their reach. Cosmetics became a necessity, and caustic soap imported from Gaul tinged graying hair into auburn locks. The rich bourgeois took pride in adorning his wife and daughter with costly clothing or jewelry, and made them the town criers of his prosperity. Even in government the role of women grew. Cato cried out that all other men rule over women, but we Romans, who rule all men, are ruled by our women. In 195 B.C., the free women of Rome swept into the Forum and demanded the repeal of the Oppian Law of 215, which had forbidden women to use gold ornaments, varicolored dresses, or chariots. Cato predicted the ruin of Rome if the law should be repealed. Livy puts into his mouth a speech that every generation has heard. If we had each of us upheld the rights and authority of the husband in our own households, we should not today have this trouble with our women. As things are now, our liberty of action, which has been annulled by female despotism at home, is crushed and trampled on here in the Forum. Call to mind all the regulations respecting women by which our ancestors curbed their license and made them obedient to their husbands. And yet with all those restrictions you can scarcely hold them in. If now you permit them to remove these restraints and to put themselves on an equality with their husbands, do you imagine that you will be able to bear them? From the moment that they become your equals, they will be your masters. The women laughed him down and stood their ground until the law was repealed. Cato revenged himself as censor by multiplying by 10 the taxes on the articles that Appius had forbidden, but the tide was in flow and could not be turned. Other laws disadvantageous to women were repealed or modified or ignored. Women won the free administration of their dowries, divorced their husbands or occasionally poisoned them, and doubted the wisdom of bearing children in an age of urban congestion and imperialistic wars. Already by 1600, Cato and Polybius had noted a decline of population, and the inability of the state to raise such armies as had risen to meet Hannibal. The new generation, having inherited world mastery, had no time or inclination to defend it. That readiness for war which had characterized the Roman landowner disappeared now that ownership was being concentrated in a few families, and a proletariat without stake in the country filled the slums of Rome. Men became brave by proxy. They crowded the amphitheater to see bloody games, and hired gladiators to fight before them at their banquets. Finishing schools were opened for both sexes, where young men and women learned to sing, play the lyre, and move gracefully. In the upper classes, manners became more refined as morals were relaxed. In the lower classes, manners continued to be coarse and vigorous, amusements often violent, language freely obscene. We get the odor of this lusty profanum vulgus in Plautus, and understand why it wearied of Terence. When a band of flute players attempted a musical concert, at a triumph in 167, the audience forced the musicians to change their performance into a boxing match. In the widening middle classes, commercialism ruled unhindered. Their wealth was based no longer on realty but on mercantile investment or management. The old morality and a few Catos could not keep this new regime of mobile capital from setting the tone of Roman life. Everyone longed for money, everyone judged or was judged in terms of money. Contractors cheated on such a scale that many government properties, for example the Macedonian mines, had to be abandoned because the lessees exploited the workers and mulcted the state to a point where the enterprise brought in more tribulation than profit. That aristocracy which, if we may believe the historians, and we must not, had once esteemed honor above life, adopted the new morality and shared in the new wealth. It thought no longer of the nation, but of class and individual privileges and perquisites. It accepted presents and liberal bribes for bestowing its favor upon men or states, and found ready reasons for war with countries that had more wealth than power. Patricians stopped plebeians in the street and asked or paid for their votes. It became a common thing for magistrates to embezzle public funds, and an uncommon thing to see them prosecuted. For who could punish robbery among his fellows when half the members of the Senate had joined in violating treaties, robbing allies, and despoiling provinces? "He who steals from a citizen," said Cato, "ends his days in fetters and chains, but he who steals from the community ends them in purple and gold." Nevertheless, the prestige of the Senate was higher than ever before. It had brought Rome successfully through 2 Punic Wars and 3 Macedonian Wars. It had challenged and overcome all of Rome's rivals, had won the subservient friendship of Egypt, and had captured so much of the world's wealth that in 146 Italy was freed from direct taxation. In the crises of war and policy it had usurped many powers of the assemblies and the magistrates, but victory sanctified its usurpations. The machinery of the comitia had been made ridiculous by empire. The turbulent peoples who now submitted to rule by a Senate largely composed of seasoned statesmen and triumphant generals would have protested passionately against having their affairs determined by the few thousand Italians who could attend the assemblies in Rome. The principle of democracy is freedom. The principle of war is discipline. Each requires the absence of the other. War demands superior intelligence and courage, quick decisions, united action, immediate obedience. The frequency of war doomed democracy. By law, the centurial assembly alone had the right to declare war or make peace, but by its power to conduct foreign relations, the Senate could usually bring matters to a point where the assembly had no longer any practical choice. The Senate controlled the treasury and all outlays of public funds, and it controlled the judiciary by the rule that all important juries had to be taken from the senatorial list. The formulation and interpretation of the laws were in the hands of the patrician class. Within this aristocracy there was an oligarchy of dominant families. Till Sulla, Roman history is a record of families rather than of individuals. No great statesman stands out, but generation after generation the same names occur in the higher offices of the state. Out of 200 consuls between 233 and 133 BC, 159 belonged to 26 families, 100 to 10. The most powerful family in this period was the Cornelii. From the Publius Cornelius Scipio, who lost the Battle of the Trebia in 218, through his son Scipio Africanus, who defeated Hannibal, to the latter's adoptive grandson Scipio Aemilianus, who destroyed Carthage in 146, the history of Roman politics and war is largely the story of this family, and the revolution that destroyed the aristocracy was begun by the Gracchi, grandsons of Africanus. The saving victory at Zama made Africanus so popular with all classes that for a time Rome was ready to give him any office he desired. But when he and his brother Lucius returned from the war in Asia in 187, the party of Cato demanded that Lucius should give an account of the money paid him by Antiochus as an indemnity to be transmitted to Rome. Africanus refused to let his brother answer. Instead, he tore the records to shreds before the Senate. Lucius was brought to trial before the assembly and was convicted of embezzlement. He was saved from punishment by the tribunician veto of Africanus's son-in-law, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. Summoned to trial in his turn, Africanus disrupted the proceedings by inviting and leading the assembly to the temple of Jupiter to celebrate the anniversary of Zama. Summoned again, he refused to obey the call, retired to his estate at Laternum, and remained there unmolested till his death. The emergence of such individualism in politics corresponded with the growth of individualism in commerce and morals. The Roman Republic would soon be destroyed by the unfettered energy of its great men. The redeeming feature of this aristocracy and this age was their awakened appreciation of the beautiful. Contact with Greek culture in Italy, Sicily, and Asia had acquainted the Romans not merely with the pertinences of luxury, but with the highest products of classic art. The conquerors brought back with them world-famous paintings and statues, cups and mirrors of chased metal, costly textiles and furniture. The older generation was shocked by Marcellus's adornment of Roman squares with the stolen sculptures of Syracuse. They complained not of the robbery, but of the idleness and vain talk among once industrious citizens who now stopped to examine and criticize trifles. Fulvius carried off 1,015 statues from Pyrrhus's collection in Ambracia. Aemilius Paulus filled 50 chariots in his triumph with the art treasures he had taken from Greece as partial payment for liberating her. Sulla, Verres, Nero, and 1,000 other Romans were to do likewise through 200 years. Greece was denuded to clothe the Roman mind. Overwhelmed with this invasion, Italian art abandoned its native quality and styles, and, with one exception, surrendered to Greek artists' themes and forms. Greek sculptors, painters, and architects, following the line of greatest gold, migrated to Rome and slowly Hellenized the capital of their conquerors. Rich Romans began to build their mansions in the Greek manner around an open court, and to adorn them with Greek columns, statuary, paintings, and furniture. Temples changed more slowly, lest the gods take offense. For them, the short cella and high podium of the Tuscan style remained the rule. But as more Olympians were domiciled in Rome, it seemed appropriate to design their homes on the slenderer Hellenic scale. In one vital respect, however, Roman art, while still taking hints from Greece, expressed with unique means and power the sturdy Italic soul. For triumphal and decorative monuments, basilicas, and aqueducts, the Roman architect replaced the architrave with the arch. In 184, Cato built in stone the Basilica Portia. 5 years later, Aemilius Paulus gave its first form to that Basilica Aemilia which his descendants would repair and beautify through many generations. The typical Roman basilica, designed for the transaction of business or law, was a long rectangle divided into nave and aisles by 2 internal rows of columns, and usually roofed with a coffered barrel vault, a development taken from Alexandria. Since the nave was higher than the aisles, a clerestory of pierced stone trellises could be carved above each aisle for the admission of light and air. Here, of course, was the essential interior form of the medieval cathedral. With these vast edifices, Rome began to take on that aspect of magnificence and strength which was to distinguish the city even after it ceased to be the capital of the world. 3. The new gods. How were the old gods faring in this age of reckless change? This book is continued on Cassette 4, Side 1.